Now, most of you should be able to recognize this model of demand and supply. And the reason why I have decided to start this video with this demand and supply model is to make sure that you understand that this is a tool of microeconomic analysis, this model of demand and supply. Meaning that whenever we make this model, we are thinking about one single product and that product's demand and that single product's supply, and therefore the equilibrium price and quantity that this model tells us is related to one individual product. So we may be conducting a microeconomic analysis of the market of apples. So this model would tell us only things about the market, the demand, the supply, the price and quantity of this single individual product. Now the reason why that is important is that now we are going to build the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which is the main analytical tool that economists use to conduct macroeconomic analysis. And this macroeconomic version of this aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, it looks exactly the same. But the looks, they are always deceiving. Because this model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply that we are now going to build in a lot of detail, although it looks exactly the same, but it tells us something entirely different. And the task of this first video is to simply understand that, look, whereas this microeconomic version, the model of demand and supply, it reflects the market of one single individual product, we want to first of all start by understanding what does the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply tries to reflect. And to understand where this model of aggregate demand and supply comes from, what does it reflect and how is it different from the similar looking micro version of demand and supply. To understand all of those things, all we need to do is we need to go back to our circular flow. So remember, in the circular flow we have two markets, the goods market and the factor market. And then on the one hand we have our households, one of the four sectors. And these households, remember we said we assume own all of the country's limited resources, and they take these resources or bring them to these factor markets where they sell them, where these households sell their factors of production, the resources of land, labor, capital and enterprise. And these resources, remember we said, are bought by the firms, the second sector of the macroeconomy. And these firms, remember we said, they buy these resources because they want to convert them into goods and services, which they bring to the goods and services market of that particular country. Now, as far as this model of aggregate demand and supply is concerned, it's really a very simple way of looking at the circular flow. And the first simplification is that, you see, whatever the total amount of output, whatever the total amount of goods that these firms decide to produce and bring to these goods and services market, we call that the country's total aggregate supply. So nothing complicated over here. Whatever the firms are deciding to produce, the total output they decide to produce, that is simply known as the country's total aggregate supply in this model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Now, once these firms have brought these goods to the goods market, remember we learned that most of these goods, they are bought by the households, and we give this the name of consumption, whatever households buy from these goods market. And then we said that some of the country's output is also bought by the firms, and what firms buy, remember we said, is known as the total investment expenditure or investment demand in the country. And then we have the other two sectors, the government. It also sometimes buys some of the country's output, and whatever the government buys, we give it the name of G. So this is something we have already developed in the earlier lectures, nothing different over here. And then finally we have the external sector, where we consider the dealings of a country with other foreign countries. And here we said that sometimes the external sector, foreign countries, will also buy some of your country's output. They will buy your country's exports. So this is the fourth sector, the demand coming from the external sector, we give it the name of exports. Now, in this model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, this total demand for the country's output, that is the demand for the country's output coming from all the four sectors, or the sum of C plus I plus G plus E, that is together known as the country's total aggregate demand for that country's output. So again, nothing complicated. You have four sectors, and when you add or sum together the demand for the country's output coming from all of these four sectors, together you say you have the country's total aggregate demand. The total demand for the country's total output. Now, obviously, this exports, we include net exports, and I will explain soon why we consider net instead of just exports. But for now, the general idea is that there are two sides of the macroeconomy. One is the supply side, where the firms are deciding how much of total aggregate supply to produce and bring to the goods market. And then on the other hand, you have the demand side, where the four sectors together decide the total aggregate demand for the country's total output. Pretty simple, straightforward stuff. Now, this model of aggregate demand and supply then says that, look, when this macroeconomy is in equilibrium, then in that equilibrium, the aggregate demand will be equal to the aggregate supply. That is, the total output that firms decide to produce will exactly be the same as the total output that these four sectors together want to buy or demand. That would give you an equilibrium in the macroeconomy. Now, the next thing that these economists who built this model of ADAS thought about was that, look, once the economy enters an equilibrium where the aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply, then the economy doesn't necessarily have to stay in this equilibrium, because both aggregate demand as well as aggregate supply, they can change. And if aggregate demand or aggregate supply changes, then the whole macroeconomic equilibrium will change. It will settle in at some new point where some new amount will be produced and demanded. Now, this is where this model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply becomes very, very similar to this microeconomic version of demand and supply. Because you see, the thing that we had to consider when we were considering this microeconomic version of demand and supply was that we had a product, let's assume such as apples. We wanted to consider the market of that single individual product. And we said that, look, there are potential consumers of these apples, and we wanted to think, or we wanted to get to the answer of the question of, how many apples these consumers will decide to buy. And then we said that, look, there are many different factors, there are many different things that will influence the decisions of these consumers of apples in terms of how many apples they want to buy. But we said that out of all of those many things that will influence these consumers of apples, it's the price of apples that will ultimately be the key factor determining how many apples these consumers wish to buy. And then we came up with this demand curve, which we said is telling us how these consumers of Apple react to different prices. And this downward sloping demand curve simply told us that, look, if the price of apples fall, then the consumers would want to buy more apples, whereas if price increases, consumers would wish to buy less apples. Now, coming back to a model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Here we are sort of thinking about the same thing, that, look, currently our economy is in equilibrium, but aggregate demand and aggregate supply, they can change. So you start thinking about, let's say, what may cause aggregate demand to change? What may cause these four sectors to start demanding more or less of output than they were previously demanding? And again, you can start thinking of many different factors that will affect the total aggregate demand for country's output. But from amongst all of these different possible factors that may influence these four sectors, we again come up to the same conclusion that, look, the most important thing that will affect the country's aggregate demand will be the price levels. Since we are now talking about the macroeconomy, we are talking about the demand for country's total output, we are talking about all the products at the same time. Therefore, instead of saying that price will determine how much of a product consumers may wish to buy, like we did in microeconomics, In macroeconomics, we say that, look, the total demand for countries, total output, will depend on the average price level in that country. So in the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, instead of looking at prices and how consumers of a single product react in terms of buying more or less of that single product, in this model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we try to look at the price level, and then we want to see on the x-axis the total amount of output that will be demanded, and we come up with a downward sloping aggregate demand curve, which is telling us something very similar as in this microeconomic model, but at the same time something which is very, very different. This model is telling us that when price levels in the economy fall, when the average price of all the things become lesser, then the four sectors together start demanding more of the country's output. So at PL1, price levels are high, the total aggregate demand in the country is low, whereas when price level falls to PL2, the total aggregate demand in the country increases. So similar concept, but make sure that these axes are different, and therefore this model is already telling us something very, very different as far as the demand side is concerned. And then as far as the aggregate supply is concerned, you see we again use the same concept that we did in microeconomics. In microeconomics, our problem was that we were looking at the market of one single product, apples, and we wanted to see that, how much apples would the producers want to produce and sell. And again, we said that, look, there are many things that can affect these producers of apple, but the most important is price. So we came up with a relationship known as the supply curve, which was telling us that, look, if price increases, the quantity supplied will increase, and vice versa. Now, as far as this macro version of aggregate demand and aggregate supply is concerned, we are again going to think about the same thing, that these firms are deciding to produce the country's total output, its aggregate supply. Now, what will determine, will they produce more or less? Again, we say that, look, there are many different things that will influence these firms at the macroeconomic level, but we consider again the most important factor to be the price level in the economy, the average level of prices in the entire country. And again, we come up with an upward sloping aggregate supply curve, which this time is telling us that, look, if the average price levels in your economy are too low, then the aggregate supply of total output that the firms want to produce will be very low, whereas if price levels start to increase, then the country's aggregate supply will also increase. The firms will be encouraged to produce more as a whole, and therefore the country's total output will increase. Now, remember, we have not explained in detail why aggregate supply is upward sloping, why aggregate demand is downward sloping. We do that step by step as we move through this section. We will look at all of that detail. But the first thing I want you to understand is that, you see, you need to make sure that when you look at these two graphs, they should not look similar to you anymore. I mean, they would look similar, but as I said, looks can be deceiving. So make sure you understand that it's the axis, the labeling on the axis, that changes everything. In the microeconomic version of this model of demand and supply, we are looking at the prices and the quantities of one single individual product, and therefore the demand and supply of one single individual product. And therefore the equilibrium that this microeconomic model gives us, that tells us the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity of apples that this economy will produce. Whereas this macroeconomic version, we are measuring the price levels of the entire economy on the y-axis, and we are measuring the total output of that economy on the x-axis, the total output of all the different goods. And this aggregate demand curve is telling us the total output that will be demanded depending on various different price levels that may exist, and this aggregate supply similarly is telling us the total output of all the goods and how it varies with the price levels in that country. And then the equilibrium that this model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply will give us, that will tell us the equilibrium price level in the entire economy and the equilibrium level of total output, or the total GDP, because total output is equal to total GDP. that your economy will be producing, right? So as I have said, we will break down this model of ADAS in a lot of detail. We will look at aggregate demand, all of its components. Why is it downward sloping? We'll look at separately at its aggregate supply. Why is it upward sloping? We will look at a few variations of aggregate supply and how its shape may change instead of just being a straight upward sloping line. But before all of that detail, let me just end this first video by making sure you understand and you remember this. This micro version of demand and supply is a very small thing. It tells you about one single individual product's market. Whereas this bigger brother, this macroeconomic version of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, this is a much bigger thing. It reflects the country's circular flow. And since this circular flow is basically in turn reflecting the entire economy, therefore, this model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, it's not just telling you about one single product. It is reflecting the whole circular flow, and therefore it is reflecting the price levels and the output of the whole macroeconomy.